Alright, today we saw Justice League Crisis on Infinite Earths Part 2, the sequel to Justice League Infinite Earths Part 1, which was a DC animated universe Tomorrowverse movie that came out like 4 or 5 months ago or something. Connor, what is the plot of Infinite Crisis Part 2?
Crisis on Infinite Earths Part 2 takes place where the last one left off. This one focusing more on Supergirl and Batman than the Flash like the first one was. Batman from the Tomorrowverse is a younger Batman who has been mostly solo, but now he has inherited a multiverse Bat family, including Batman Beyond, Huntress, who's his daughter, Damian Wayne, who is his son, Batman Beyond, Batwing, who is Morgan Freeman from The Dark Knight's son, except he's Iron Man too. You got fucking Robin from Earth 2, he's all grown up, Dick Grayson. And then you got Supergirl, who's brainwashed by the Monitor into forgetting her past, and then she remembers her past, and then she's like, this sucks. Then the Psycho Pirate's like teamed up with the Monitor, but then he changes his mind and wants to team up with the Anti-Monitor, who's like the Monitor but even more eviler than the Monitor, but he also wants to fight the Monitor, and he's like, why'd you do this to me, Psycho Pirate? And Psycho Pirate's like, I don't know, dude, I'm a Psycho Pirate, I have a stupid name. But I've got a cool costume, but I'm mostly just a weird character. And Wonder Woman has her little thing where she travels to one Earth where the Amazonian women have enslaved the men. You got John Stewart. Yeah, Constantine's like 1,000 years old, and John Stewart meets him. He's like, oh, my name is John. And then John Constantine's like, that's not a name I've heard in many years. And then it turns out he remembers he's John Constantine. And he's like, oi, mate, I'm John Constantine again. And they fight, as Shadow the Hedgehog would say, and Sonic and Shadow the Hedgehog for PS2. They fight disgusting black creatures for a long ass time. But about an hour and 15 minutes out of an hour and a half is tremendously boring exposition, followed by tremendously boring action scenes. So Aiden, what was your thoughts on Justice League Crisis on Infinite Earths Part 2?
I don't have a lot to say. This was a follow-up to the first one, which I thought was surprisingly good, because it focused mostly on the story of the Flash and him kind of fighting against loss. And this one is a lot of exposition about the lore of the Monitors and the Anti-Monitors, and a guy who read a lot of books and read so many books that he became a mind-reading Nazi, and then he becomes a weird alien ghost thing that can shoot anger into people's minds. Supergirl is sad that her thing is gone. Constantine and John Stewart kind of just like stand around talking about the good old days. Superman fights like 5 people. Wonder Woman says slavery's bad. It bounces between all these plots that are essentially just nothing exposition about like the alternate worlds. There's some guy who has a gun and he meets a good Gorilla Grodd, and good Gorilla Grodd says, I'm good Gorilla Grodd. You don't have to kill me, I'm not an evil gorilla like the ones that killed your family. And he's like, oh, okay. And then he cries when Gorilla Grodd gets killed by a fucking ghost demon thing.
That's Commandi.
And the whole plot is just like, all the exposition basically just leads up to a point where one character, I don't remember who, says you need to shine light on the ghost shadow demons, and they blow up. And then all the fight scenes are just like Wonder Woman runs up a building, grabs a flashlight, and Jon Stewart uses his lantern to make a really bright light.
The whole Bat family assembles to generically throw grenades, and then they're all like, "Batman, you're a dick," and then he's like, "We gotta toss grenades at these guys, please." And they're like, "Okay."
There's just nothing going on. It's somehow a 3-movie trilogy arc where the first half is an interesting character story and sets up the stakes, and then instead of the second being like rising action, it's a lore movie, like a Matt Pat lore movie about who the Monitor is and who the Psycho Pirate is, and it's just capped off with the shittiest fight scenes, the most boring fight scenes ever.
I guess.
And then it ends.
Yeah,
like,
really
I don't know what to say about it. There's nothing going on in the movie. It's just an hour of word vomit as they explain how this ghost man got his evil emotion ghost powers, and the anti-Monitor and the Monitor like talk to him and say, "I'm a good guy because I want to fix the world," and the anti-Monitor says, I don't. That's the plot of the movie. I don't know what to say about it. It's really dull. These Tomorrowverse movies look okay. The art style's fine, and the animation's good enough, but they don't really do anything with it because the action scenes in this movie are dreadfully boring, and they just fight shadow ghosts with light bulbs. And I don't know. There's nothing to grab onto. There's no arc or story or character. It really is just like a filler chapter where they explain overarching plot beats that really didn't need to be over-explained in this format. And that's kind of all there is to say about it, honestly. So Connor, what'd you think of Infinite Crisis Part 2?
I thought it was pretty shit, to be honest. It's boring. Like I said, like Aiden was saying, there's a lot of exposition. There's some new characters that come along into play. The Flash is pretty much a non-entity. Supergirl is re-explained, basically. Here's the problem with the Tomorrowverse. It was like... So these DC animated movies have been going on since, like, 2007, but have consistently had universes since, like, 2009, and this is now the third hard reboot, and then there was also a bunch of standalone movies. And the Tomorrowverse has been essentially a couple standalone made-up stories, like Green Lantern, Beware My Power, starring Jon Stewart, and the Supergirl Legion of Superhero movies. And then James Gunn took over DC, so much like the DCEU, since he has plans to utilize animation in his cinematic universe as a core part of the storytelling, they had to wrap up. So they said, okay, we'll wrap it up with this Crisis on Infinite Earths, and that'll kind of put an end to the standard DC animated movie direct-to-DVD cycle, which I assume also in part has to do with the fact that Warner would rather move those resources to make tie-ins to the DCU, James Gunn's DCU, and probably mostly put them on HBO Max as mainstream physical media starts to die and direct-to-DVD DC movies start to make less and less financial sense would be one aspect I think is kind of part of it. So what better to wrap it up than Crisis, which is the most famous event comic DC ever made, and one of the first, along with Marvel's Secret Wars, which is Marvel's most famous event. The issue is the movie has the uphill battle of Crisis being a fanboy lore comic.
It's a culmination of a bunch
So,
of shit. The
you're
Tomorrowverse
kind
doesn't
of
have.
put into two awkward spots. First off, the Tomorrowverse is too small to really sustain a Crisis on Infinite Earths. It's the same problem with, like, Walter Hamada at one point said he wanted to do a DCEU Crisis on Infinite Earths. It wasn't big enough. The problem is the Crisis is big and convoluted, and you basically just had to be a subscriber to like 90% of the DC line in the 1980s. Most of these characters aren't even relevant or used in the lines of comics anymore, which is a problem. So not only do you have to explain Monitor and Anti-Monitor, you have to explain why every character gets put in an approximation of where they were in the original Crisis on Infinite Earths comic. Yeah. And you kind of have to rewrite it because there's a lot of missing lore due to the fact that Crisis on Infinite Earths is a culmination of 45 years of DC lore at the time, and this is the culmination of 3 years of Tomorrowverse lore. They don't really like introduce the New 52 style animated universe, whatever abbreviation that had. They don't really introduce like the DCAU, which is like the Batman the Animated Series and stuff, unless this might be the same Batman Beyond, but he's stylistically different, so I don't know. And it's just like, I don't know, they're just kind of like, well, now we're on Earth, blah blah blah, and this happens. Also, Earth 3 has already been destroyed, which is an interesting aspect of the first movie. There's just not really much to sink your teeth into, and it's a lot of exposition to set up this final battle with the Anti-Monitor and Monitor that's presumably going to come into Part 3, which we don't really get here. And instead of coming up with like cool creatures for them to fight, they just replace them with shadow creatures, which are more or less just there. So the tremendous amount of characters they came up with that aren't essential to the plot have something to do. Like, no one's really essential to the plot except Supergirl, because she's there with the Monitor and Psycho Pirate. The Monitor and Psycho Pirate and the Anti-Monitor. Those are the 4 important characters. You have the Superboy, who's a proxy for Superboy Prime, which, if I tried to explain Superboy Prime, it'd get confusing, because then I also have to talk about all the other Supermans, because there's a lot of weird shit. But anyways, he's a proxy for Superboy Prime, but he's not really that important in Crisis. He kind of becomes more important in Infinite Crisis, which a lot of the characters do. We're never going to get. So there's a lot of non-important characters that need to be here for iconography's sake. This whole movie is kind of... The problem is Part 1 ends somewhat definitively. I mean, obviously there's a cliffhanger, but Part 2 really needs to reshuffle the pieces so that you can make Part 3 really solid. And rather than like Empire Strikes Back it, where there's like a major like hero's downfall and sets up the stakes of Part 3, this is 100% 90 minutes of lore that you have to pay $25 for the Blu-ray or 4K or DVD copy of. And it's not worth that much because it's really boring, and you're using the medium of animation to have a bunch of colorful comic book heroes stand there and talk.
To give Wikipedia summaries of places that they go to get all the necessary points to reach the climax.
Yep, it is very much building towards the climax of the third part of a movie. And it is far less satisfying as a film than the first one, which had something of an arc. And the third one is presumably going to be 90 minutes of fight scenes.
Yep.
Because all of the exposition and build-up was put into this movie, making this a somewhat tedious watch. I would say the best part of it is the first 30 minutes, which sees Supergirl brainwashed on the Monitor ship. That was kind of interesting. But pretty much everything else sucked. I do like the Tomorrowverse art style. I think it's a good way to reasonably bring the comics to a direct to DVD film. But yeah. So Aiden, would you recommend Crisis on Infinite Earths Part 2.
No, but I guess the caveat is that if you watched part 1 and you plan on watching part 3, and part 1 was pretty good, and part 3 will probably be the exciting part, then I guess you're kind of forced to, because the movie's not going to make any fucking sense if you skip all this bullshit. But it's not an enjoyable watch. It's a potentially necessary watch if you're committed to watching this little trilogy arc thing. But I definitely maybe wait a while before it gets closer to the third part and suffer through this, I guess. I definitely don't watch this standalone if you haven't watched the first part, because it's boring enough if you know what's going on. I can't imagine how it is if you're getting plopped in the middle. Connor, would you recommend Crisis on Infinite Earths Part 2?
I would say wait on it, and the reason being is probably like 2 or 3 months after the trilogy concludes. They'll probably sell like some sort of they'll probably sell something called Crisis on Infinite Earths Deluxe Edition, which they do with a lot of their multi-part animated movies, which is just everything packed together for like $25. And this is probably going to be most satisfying watching as like a long 4.5 hour movie. Even so, the second act is a little tedious and boring. But depending how they execute part 3, it might be essential to watch for that. I think part 1 is pretty okay. Part 2 is kind of sucked. Hopefully part 3 can kind of stick the landing, or it's all kind of pointless. So I wouldn't recommend it yet. I'd probably wait till see how part 3 pans out, and then maybe buy all 3 in a pack or on sale or what have you. I feel like following this like I have for the purpose of reviewing has not been the most rewarding thing.
No.
It wasn't the most rewarding way to watch it because we don't know how part 3 is going to turn out. Part 2's taking a lot of wind out of the sails, so to speak.
Oh yeah.
And we'll watch part 3 and probably have more definitive answers then. But I wouldn't rush out to buy it at the current state when part 3 isn't out yet. So yeah, that was part 2 of Justice League, the epic conclusion to
Nothing.
DC animated direct movies, and the third reboot that started like a year and a half ago and is now being rebooted again.